Hello, curious minds. I'm the Apex Storyteller, here to share a tale to keep you company tonight. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now get comfortable and let's dive in. Sophia's breath quickened as she walked the empty streets of her desolate town, each step swallowed by an unsettling silence. The flickering streetlights above seemed to dim with every passing second, casting distorted shadows that danced just out of sight. She paused, her heart pounding as she heard it, a faint whisper, low and chilling, carried by the cold wind. She turned sharply. Sophia had always found something strangely calming about the stillness of her small town, Willow Creek. There was a quiet charm to it, a rhythm that made it feel like time had slowed down here. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant hum of old streetlights flickering in the night. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the only danger seemed to be the occasional stray dog or an unexpected thunderstorm. But tonight there was something different in the air. The sky had darkened earlier than usual, and the thick clouds seemed to swallow up any trace of light from the stars. Sophia had worked late at the diner, cleaning up after the last of the late-night customers, and now she was walking home. She usually enjoyed the walk, the quiet streets, and the fresh air, but tonight her feet felt heavy, as if the pavement itself was pressing down on her. Her steps echoed in the emptiness, a rhythm that seemed too loud for the dead silence that enveloped the town. As she walked past the rows of identical houses, she couldn't shake the feeling that the houses were watching her, silent, looming structures that looked almost too still. She glanced at the windows, but they were dark, each one reflecting only the faint glow of the streetlights above. Then she heard it. A faint rustling sound, like something moving just outside her line of vision. She paused, holding her breath, straining to hear. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low, whispering hum. Sophia's heart began to race. She'd lived in this town her whole life, and nothing had ever made her feel this uneasy. She shook her head, trying to shake off the irrational fear crawling up her spine. It's just the wind, she told herself. Nothing more. But the sound came again, closer this time. It was a dragging noise, like feet scraping against the gravel. Her pulse quickened. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone walking behind her. But the street was empty, bathed in the cold light of the street lamps. The only movement was the swaying of the trees in the breeze. Sophia took a deep breath and continued walking, her pace now quickening. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the sound followed her, closer this time, like something heavy was being dragged across the ground. She glanced over her shoulder again, but this time she didn't see anything. Yet the feeling remained, a crawling sensation along her skin, like invisible eyes were watching her every move. Her footsteps became faster, more frantic, but the sound didn't stop. It was always there, just behind her. She could feel it getting closer with every step. She turned another corner, heading toward the park, hoping the open space would make her feel safer. But the park was no better. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind, their shadows stretching long across the path. The dragging sound was unmistakable now. It was right behind her, so close she could feel it against her skin. Sophia broke into a run. She didn't look back, afraid that if she did, she might see something she wasn't ready to see. Her breath was coming in shallow bursts, her chest tight with fear. She needed to get home. She needed to lock the door and hide. But when she reached the park's entrance, her foot caught on something in the dirt. She stumbled and fell, her palms scraping against the ground as she tried to steady herself. The dragging sound stopped. Everything went eerily quiet. Sophia lay on the ground for a moment, catching her breath. She felt a strange sensation, like the air around her had grown colder, thicker, as if the world itself had paused. She slowly pushed herself up, but before she could get to her feet, she heard it again, closer than ever. A whisper, so soft it almost seemed like a breath against her ear. "Sophia?" She froze. The voice was unmistakable, the tone low and cold, as if it came from the depths of the earth itself. She didn't know what was worse, the fact that she had heard it or the fact that it had come from behind her. Sophia spun around, but once again there was nothing. No figure, no movement, only the cold, empty park. But that voice, it lingered in the air, clinging to the space around her like a thick fog. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly rose to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. Every part of her screamed to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but her feet felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The silence now felt oppressive, as though something unseen was pressing in on her from all sides. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the dirt path, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't stop until she reached her house, the familiar sight of her front door a fleeting sense of comfort. She fumbled for her keys, her hands trembling as she tried to unlock the door. Finally, the door clicked open and she rushed inside, slamming it shut behind her. She locked the door and leaned against it, her heart still racing. Sophia stood in the darkness of her small foyer, her mind racing. What was that? What had just happened? She could still hear the faint whisper of her name, echoing in her mind. As she walked into the kitchen to make herself some tea, she caught a glimpse of something in the window. For a split second, she saw a figure standing just beyond the glass, motionless, staring in. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned away quickly, but when she dared to look again, the figure was gone. Was it real? Or had her mind played tricks on her? Sophia's heart thudded painfully in her chest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching her. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as she tried to carry on with her normal routine. The days that followed were a blur of half-forgotten conversations and interrupted thoughts. Each time she looked over her shoulder, she half expected to see the shadowy figure from the park standing just behind her, but the figure was never there. Still, the lingering sense of unease stayed with her, clinging to her every step. That evening, as the sun began to set and the familiar chill of dusk filled the air, Sophia stood by the window, her eyes scanning the street outside. The quiet town of Willow Creek, which she had always known to be calm, felt different now, unsettling, almost suffocating. The streetlights flickered like dying stars, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. The world outside was starting to fade into darkness, and with it, her sense of security. She sighed and walked away from the window, trying to push away the mounting anxiety in her chest. It had been nearly 2 days since the encounter at the park, but the voice, the whisper that had called her name, still echoed in her mind. Sophia had tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. A sudden knock on the door broke her thoughts. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. No one ever visited her at this hour, especially not in the town's dead silence. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Outside stood a figure she didn't recognize. A man, tall and thin, with dark hair and a coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. His face was obscured by shadows, his features sharp as though carved from stone. He stood perfectly still, waiting. Sophia hesitated. She didn't know this person, but there was something familiar about him, something she couldn't quite place. Her breath caught in her throat. The knock repeated, this time louder, more insistent. "Hello?" she called through the door, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can I help you?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the door. Something about the way he stared made her feel like he was looking right through her. Sophia's hands trembled as she backed away from the door, her pulse quickening. She didn't know what it was, but a deep, instinctual fear flooded her chest. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and for a moment she couldn't bring herself to move. After what felt like an eternity, the man spoke in a voice that was eerily calm, almost distant. "I'm looking for someone," he said softly, his voice muffled by the door. "I know she's in there." The word sent a chill through Sophia's entire body. How could he know? How could he possibly know? Without thinking, she rushed to the back of the house, glancing over her shoulder as she went. The man had stopped knocking. There was an unsettling silence on the other side of the door. She peeked out the window, her breath shallow, her heart thundering in her chest. He was still standing there, unmoving, staring into the darkness as though waiting for something. Waiting for her. Sophia's mind raced. She didn't know who this man was or why he was looking for her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a random visitor. There was something off about him. Something that made her skin crawl. The man's eyes suddenly shifted, as though he had sensed her watching him. He turned, locking eyes with her through the window. His stare was unblinking, intense, as if he knew exactly where she was, even though the window had been slightly obscured by the curtain. Sophia gasped and stumbled backward. The sensation of his gaze lingered even after she stepped away from the window. It was like a cold weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Sophia stood frozen for a moment, her mind spinning with a million questions. What had just happened? Who was he? And why had he said he was looking for someone? Her first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped her. The town of Willow Creek was small, peaceful, and nothing ever happened here. What could she possibly tell them? A strange man had knocked on her door and claimed to be looking for someone? It sounded absurd even to her. But what if he wasn't just a man? What if he was something else? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She thought about the events from the other night, the voice calling her name, the shadows that seemed to follow her, the feeling that she was being watched. Was all of it connected? A faint sound interrupted her thoughts. A tap, gentle at first, then growing louder. It came from the back door just beyond the kitchen. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she crept toward the door, each step echoing in the silence. She reached for the handle, her hands shaking uncontrollably. What if it was him again? What if he was standing outside, waiting for her to open the door? She took a deep breath and yanked the door open. Nothing. The backyard was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights that lined the street beyond. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and the shadows cast by the branches danced across the ground. But as she turned to close the door, something caught her eye, a small, folded piece of paper wedged between the doorframe and the wall. Sophia's heart raced. She picked up the paper carefully, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The note was simple, written in bold, jagged handwriting. I know what you've seen. Don't run. Stay quiet. It's already too late. Sophia's blood ran cold. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as she tried to carry on with her normal routine. The days that followed were a blur of half-forgotten conversations and interrupted thoughts. Each time she looked over her shoulder, she half expected to see the shadowy figure from the park standing just behind her. But the figure was never there. Still, the lingering sense of unease stayed with her, clinging to her every step. That evening, as the sun began to set and the familiar chill of dusk filled the air, Sophia stood by the window, her eyes scanning the street outside. The quiet town of Willow Creek, which she had always known to be calm, felt different now, unsettling, almost suffocating. The streetlights flickered like dying stars, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. The world outside was starting to fade into darkness, and with it, her sense of security. She sighed and walked away from the window, trying to push away the mounting anxiety in her chest. It had been nearly 2 days since the encounter at the park, but the voice, the whisper that had called her name, still echoed in her mind. Sophia had tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. A sudden knock on the door broke her thoughts. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. No one ever visited her at this hour, especially not in the town's dead silence. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Outside stood a figure she didn't recognize. A man, tall and thin, with dark hair and a coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. His face was obscured by shadows, his features sharp as though carved from stone. He stood perfectly still, waiting. Sophia hesitated. She didn't know this person, but there was something familiar about him, something she couldn't quite place. Her breath caught in her throat. The knock repeated, this time louder, more insistent. "Hello?" she called through the door, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can I help you?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the door. Something about the way he stared made her feel like he was looking right through her. Sophia's hands trembled as she backed away from the door, her pulse quickening. She didn't know what it was, but a deep, instinctual fear flooded her chest. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and for a moment she couldn't bring herself to move. After what felt like an eternity, the man spoke in a voice that was eerily calm, almost distant. "I'm looking for someone," he said softly, his voice muffled by the door. "I know she's in there." The word sent a chill through Sophia's entire body. How could he know? How could he possibly know? Without thinking, she rushed to the back of the house, glancing over her shoulder as she went. The man had stopped knocking. There was an unsettling silence on the other side of the door. She peeked out the window, her breath shallow, her heart thundering in her chest. He was still standing there, unmoving, staring into the darkness as though waiting for something. Waiting for her. Sophia's mind raced. She didn't know who this man was or why he was looking for her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a random visitor. There was something off about him. Something that made her skin crawl. The man's eyes suddenly shifted, as though he had sensed her watching him. He turned, locking eyes with her through the window. His stare was unblinking, intense, as if he knew exactly where she was, even though the window had been slightly obscured by the curtain. Sophia gasped and stumbled backward. The sensation of his gaze lingered even after she stepped away from the window. It was like a cold weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Sophia stood frozen for a moment, her mind spinning with a million questions. What had just happened? Who was he? And why had he said he was looking for someone? Her first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped her. The town of Willow Creek was small, peaceful, and nothing ever happened here. What could she possibly tell them? A strange man had knocked on her door and claimed to be looking for someone? It sounded absurd even to her. But what if he wasn't just a man? What if he was something else? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She thought about the events from the other night, the voice calling her name, the shadows that seemed to follow her, the feeling that she was being watched. Was all of it connected? A faint sound interrupted her thoughts. A tap, gentle at first, then growing louder. It came from the back door just beyond the kitchen. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she crept toward the door, each step echoing in the silence. She reached for the handle, her hand shaking uncontrollably. What if it was him again? What if he was standing outside, waiting for her to open the door? She took a deep breath and yanked the door open. Nothing. The backyard was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights that lined the street beyond. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and the shadows cast by the branches danced across the ground. But as she turned to close the door, something caught her eye, a small, folded piece of paper wedged between the doorframe and the wall. Sophia's heart raced. She picked up the paper carefully, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The note was simple, written in bold, jagged handwriting. I know what you've seen. Don't run. Stay quiet. It's already too late. Sophia's blood ran cold. Sophia's hands trembled as she read the note. The words seemed to burn into her mind, each letter searing her thoughts with an icy dread. I know what you've seen. Don't run. Stay quiet. It's already too late. Her pulse raced and a wave of nausea washed over her. It was as if the note knew her every fear, every dark corner of her mind. She scanned the backyard again, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the darkness was empty. Silent. She slammed the door shut, locking it behind her, and leaned against it, trying to calm her breath. Stay quiet. It's already too late. The words echoed in her mind, repeating like a haunting lullaby. Her thoughts spiraled into confusion and terror. What did the note mean? What had she seen? She hadn't seen anything, not really. Or had she? Her gaze flickered to the living room window where the dim glow of streetlights cast long, crooked shadows against the walls. She felt it again, the feeling. The one that gnawed at the pit of her stomach, the one that made her skin crawl and her heart race with every passing second. Someone is watching. She could almost feel their eyes on her, penetrating her every move. She spun around, but the room was empty, still as it had always been. Her thoughts turned back to the mysterious man from earlier. Who was he? What did he want? And why had he said he was looking for her? It didn't make sense. She didn't know anyone in town, not well enough for someone to be searching for her. But the note, it was impossible to ignore. There was something unnatural about it. Something wrong. A sudden crash of thunder from outside broke her thoughts, followed by a downpour of rain. The storm had come out of nowhere, and the wind howled against the house, rattling the windows and making the entire building groan in protest. Sophia jumped, startled by the force of the storm, and quickly grabbed her phone from the table. The screen flickered to life, but before she could call for help, a message popped up on the screen. It was from an unknown number. I told you not to run. It's already too late. Sophia's heart slammed into her chest, her throat tightening. She dropped the phone onto the couch as though it had burned her. Her breathing became shallow and her mind raced. How could this person know what the note said? She had never told anyone about it, never shared a single word with anyone. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs broke the silence. A soft creak, followed by a slow, deliberate thump. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was upstairs. Sophia froze, every muscle in her body locking up. The steps grew louder, closer. Her eyes darted toward the stairs, then to the door leading outside. Should she run? Should she hide? The footsteps grew louder still, but then they stopped. For a long moment, all was still. Sophia held her breath, not daring to make a sound. The storm outside raged on, but within the house, there was nothing but a suffocating silence. She didn't move, didn't blink. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, pounding like a drum, as if the very air around her was thickening, suffocating her. Then, without warning, the door to the upstairs bedroom creaked open. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her mind screamed at her to escape, but her body betrayed her. She could feel it though, it was close. Whatever was upstairs was now moving toward the stairs. Slowly, ever so slowly, Sophia crept toward the hallway, pressing herself against the wall. She didn't dare to make a sound. The only sound she could hear was the rhythmic thumping of her own heartbeat. As she peered around the corner, her stomach dropped. A shadow, tall and thin, moved past the staircase, gliding effortlessly across the hallway. It was as if it didn't even touch the ground, its movements too smooth, too deliberate. It stopped just outside the kitchen, its shape flickering in the dim light. Sophia held her breath, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. This wasn't just a man. This wasn't just some random stranger. Whatever was in her house, it wasn't human. Her eyes strained in the darkness as she tried to make out the figure. But it wasn't clear. The shadow was too vague, too intangible. She couldn't see its face, but she felt its presence. It was waiting for her. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to hide, to run, to do anything to get away, but she remained frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the shadow. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure? No, not a figure. A face. A pale, ghostly face peering around the corner from the living room. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and dark, but the most disturbing part was the mouth. It was stretched into a grotesque grin, far too wide for any human face. Sophia's body finally responded to the terror coursing through her. She bolted from the hallway, her feet pounding against the wooden floor as she rushed for the back door. She didn't care about being quiet anymore. She didn't care if she alerted whatever was in the house to her location. She just had to get out. But as her hand touched the door handle, she heard it, the sound. A low, guttural growl. It came from just behind her. Before she could turn, a cold hand gripped her shoulder, sending a shockwave of terror through her body. The force was immense, as though the hand was made of ice, and it pulled her back toward the dark corner of the room. She screamed, struggling to break free, but it was useless. The grip tightened, dragging her further into the abyss of the unknown. And then silence. She couldn't remember how long she had been trapped in the dark. All she knew was the presence of something. Someone. Something was near. Something was watching her. Sophia was no longer alone in her own home. Sophia's breath came in shallow gasps as she fought against the ice-cold grip that still clutched her shoulder. She tried to turn her head, but the force was too strong. It was as if something, or someone, was pulling her into the heart of the house, deeper into the dark. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping in a chaotic murmur that sent a wave of dread crashing through her chest. "You shouldn't have come back," a voice hissed, its tone so close she could almost feel its icy breath on her skin. Sophia's eyes widened in panic. She knew she had to escape, but her legs felt like they were trapped in cement, unwilling to move. Every instinct screamed for her to fight back, but she couldn't. Her body betrayed her, paralyzed with fear. The whispering continued, each word colder than the last. "You should have stayed away." Finally, with every ounce of strength she had left, Sophia managed to wrench herself free from the grip. She stumbled backward, her hands scrambling for the nearest source of light, her fingers brushing the wall until they found the light switch. The room erupted in a harsh, fluorescent glow, blinding her for a moment. But as her vision adjusted, her stomach lurched. The house was exactly as it had been, the same furniture, the same layout. Nothing had changed, but something was different. The air felt heavier, oppressive. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, thicker. As if they were moving, slowly, like fingers creeping across the walls, reaching for her. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, and her breath quickened as she scanned the room. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat, each thud echoing in her ears, louder than anything else. She stepped forward cautiously, every step seeming to make the shadows shift ever so slightly. Was it just her mind playing tricks, or were the corners of the room closing in? The hallway behind her felt endless, stretching farther than it should. The walls, once familiar, now felt unfamiliar, hostile. Her pulse quickened as she glanced toward the door, the one she had been trying to reach just moments ago. But the way to freedom seemed blocked. The door now seemed impossibly far away, too distant to escape through. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, heavy. Sophia froze. She knew with a bone-deep certainty that she wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was up there moving, waiting. But for what? Why didn't it just come for her? Her legs trembled as the fear began to rise again. She needed to move, but her mind screamed for her to stay still, to stay quiet, to not make a sound. But she had no choice. Slowly, she crept toward the staircase, every step feeling like an eternity. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. She reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up into the darkness. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly, leading into a void. Was she really hearing those footsteps? Or was she imagining them? Sophia clenched her fists, forcing herself to move. She had no choice. She had to go up. She had to face whatever was in her house, whatever had been following her. She stepped forward, the stairs creaking under her weight. Each creak felt like a warning, like the house itself was alive, reacting to her every movement. Her breath came faster now, each step sending her further into the unknown. As she reached the top of the stairs, a cold gust of air brushed against her skin, and she turned sharply, feeling a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The hallway stretched before her, darker than it should have been, the shadows now much deeper, swallowing everything in their path. She moved cautiously, her heart pounding louder than before. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, but it was the silence that unnerved her. The oppressive, heavy silence that felt suffocating. Her eyes scanned the hallway, stopping at the door to the guest room, the one that had been locked for as long as she could remember. The door was ajar. Sophia's pulse quickened. She hadn't opened it. She hadn't touched it. Yet there it was, slightly cracked as though it had been waiting for her. Her gut twisted with fear, but something inside her, something she couldn't explain, drove her forward. She took a hesitant step toward the door. The whispering voices, soft at first, started again. It was as though the house itself was speaking to her. Come closer. The voice was unmistakable now, chilling her to the core. We've been waiting for you. With a shaking hand, she pushed the door open, her heart thundering in her chest. The room was dark, but her eyes slowly adjusted and she saw it. The room wasn't empty. A figure stood in the far corner, its back turned to her. The shadows twisted around it as though they were alive, reaching out to wrap themselves around the figure's form. It was tall, too tall, and it was still, unmoving. Sophia's legs felt like jelly, but she couldn't look away. She couldn't run. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sight before her. The figure slowly turned, its face now visible in the dim light. It was a face she knew, familiar yet distorted, warped by time and horror. It was her own. Her breath hitched in her throat. The thing standing before her wore her face, her eyes, her expression. But it was wrong. It wasn't her. And then it smiled. The smile was wide, far too wide. The edges of its mouth stretched beyond human limits, twisting into a grotesque grin. Its eyes gleamed with malice, dark and endless. It's too late to leave, Sophia, it whispered, its voice a sickening, mocking echo of her own. She staggered backward, but the figure, her figure, moved with unnatural speed, stepping closer, closing the distance between them with every heartbeat. The smile never faltered. Sophia felt the walls closing in, the room shrinking, and the whispers in her head growing louder, like 1,000 voices, all of them shouting at once. You can't escape, the figure whispered again, its breath colder than ice. You're already part of this house. Part of us. With one final scream of terror, Sophia collapsed to the floor, her vision darkening at the edges. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure leaning over her, its eyes full of infinite darkness as it whispered one last time. You're ours now. And then there was nothing. Sophia's eyes fluttered open, her head pounding as if 1,000 voices had been screaming in her mind. Her body felt heavy, numb, as though she had been trapped in an endless nightmare for days. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the dim light filtering through the window. She was no longer on the floor of the guest room, but in her own bed, beneath the thick comforter she recognized from years ago. The room was eerily still, the air thick with an oppressive weight that made her feel as though she was being watched. Her heart raced, every instinct telling her to flee, to run as far as possible, but where could she go? How could she escape when the very house she was in seemed alive? Alive with memories, with whispers, with something else, something far darker. She tried to sit up, but dizziness hit her in waves. The bed creaked beneath her as she steadied herself, the familiar surroundings only adding to her confusion. Was this real? Had she really been in the guest room? Had she been dreaming? Or had she been dragged back into this cursed place by forces beyond her understanding? Her eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything that could explain what had happened. Everything seemed to be in place. Her dresser was still in the corner, her clothes neatly folded as if untouched. The soft glow of the bedside lamp flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the walls. But then, her gaze landed on the old ornate mirror hanging above the dresser. Something felt wrong about it. Sophia couldn't tear her eyes away. The mirror, framed in heavy, tarnished silver, seemed to shimmer slightly as though it was alive. The surface of the glass appeared to ripple faintly, distorting the reflection of the room beyond it. It wasn't just the normal reflection, there was something off. The shadows in the glass were deeper, darker, more pronounced. She felt her heart skip a beat, her body tensing. The reflection of her own face stared back at her, but it wasn't the same as it had been moments ago. Her eyes, wide with fear, were filled with something else. Something darker, something that didn't belong to her. Her reflection smiled. But Sophia hadn't moved. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as the reflection of herself in the mirror smiled wider, that same twisted, grotesque grin she had seen before in the guest room. It wasn't a reflection anymore, it was something else, something alive, something malicious. "I've been waiting," the figure in the mirror whispered, its voice a cold, hollow echo of her own. "You can't hide from me." The words cut through Sophia like a dagger, the air growing colder around her. She stumbled back, almost falling off the bed, her heart racing as the whispering continued. Her breath came faster, shallow, desperate. She knew she had to leave the room, but her legs felt like lead as if they refused to move. "You're not alone anymore," the reflection whispered again, its grin never faltering. "You're with us now, and we never leave." Sophia's hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing against the cold, metal frame. She had to get away from the mirror, but her feet refused to move. The figure in the glass wasn't just a reflection anymore, it was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. A low growl filled the room, sending a shiver through her spine. She turned sharply, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but nothing was there. The growl was just the beginning. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows growing longer, stretching across the floor like creeping tendrils. The mirror, it was growing. The reflection of her own room was no longer just a mirror image, it was a window into something else, something dark and twisted, like a place where time and reality didn't exist. It felt like the house itself was folding in on itself, like the walls were closing in, the darkness swallowing everything. Sophia felt herself being pulled toward the mirror. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was as if something was reaching out to her, luring her closer, forcing her to look deeper into the abyss that had once been a reflection of her room. "Come closer," the voice urged, its tone sickeningly sweet. "It's waiting for you. You belong here." Sophia's body trembled, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet were frozen. The mirror pulled at her like an invisible force, drawing her closer to its surface. The distorted image of her reflection reached out its hand, as though it were beckoning her in, trying to pull her inside. Her pulse raced, her skin crawling with an intense, overwhelming fear. What was it? What did it want from her? She had to get away. She couldn't stay here. But as her hand hovered over the cold glass of the mirror, something changed. Her reflection stopped smiling. It frowned. Its eyes, those dark, endless pits, grew darker, deeper, as though they were pulling her in. The reflection of her own face twisted, contorted in agony, its mouth stretching wider, the smile now a grotesque scream. "You're mine," it whispered in a voice that was no longer hers. "You're all ours now." Sophia's hand recoiled in horror, and in that moment she stumbled backward, falling hard onto the floor. The whispering stopped, but the air was thick with tension. The mirror, the reflection, was no longer just a reflection. It had become something else. A presence. A force. Sophia scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to get out. She had to leave before it was too late. But as she looked back at the mirror one last time, she saw something else. The reflection wasn't just of the room anymore. It had changed. The mirror now showed a hallway, a long, dark hallway that stretched into the abyss. At the end of it stood a figure. It was standing still, watching her. Sophia's blood ran cold. It was her. But not her. It was the same twisted version of herself she had seen in the guest room. The thing with the smile that never stopped. And it was coming closer. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled away from the mirror, her eyes wide, her heart thundering in her chest. The image of the twisted reflection still burned in her mind. The grin, the hollow eyes, the way it had reached out for her as if it wanted to pull her inside. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she had seen wasn't just a hallucination. It was real. But was it? The hallway she now stood in felt colder, darker. Every step she took seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the very walls were listening. Her skin crawled, the air thick with dread. She turned away from the mirror, eyes scanning the room, hoping for something, anything, that could explain the nightmare she was caught in. But there was no explanation. No answers. Only more silence. Sophia's feet moved on their own, her legs heavy, stiff, as if each step was a struggle. She had to get out. She didn't know how she knew, but the walls, the house itself, felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her, pushing her towards something terrible. She made her way to the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the cold, brass knob, but when she turned it, nothing happened. The door wouldn't budge. Her pulse quickened. Her mind raced. The door had been fine earlier. Why wouldn't it open now? Panic surged through her veins and she pulled harder on the handle, desperate to escape whatever force was keeping her trapped. Nothing. Click. A sound from behind her made her freeze. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the darkness of the hallway beyond the room. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as her body froze, every muscle tense with fear. She hadn't heard anyone come in. She hadn't heard any doors open. And yet, the sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of someone walking, stepping closer and closer, deliberately, methodically, as though it was stalking her. She turned slowly, her gaze falling on the darkness at the end of the room. Her stomach twisted in knots as she saw something move. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. It was too wrong. The figure was tall, tall enough to make her feel small, insignificant in comparison. Its shape was barely visible in the dim light, but it was unmistakable. It was wearing a long black coat, and its face was hidden in shadow. Its movements were unnaturally slow, deliberate, almost like a predator toying with its prey. And it was coming closer. Sophia's breath became shallow, her heart slamming against her chest as she tried to back away. But with each step she took, the figure seemed to close the distance between them, as if the space itself was shrinking. There was no way to outrun it. No way to hide. The sound of footsteps was now all she could hear, the rhythmic thud of each step reverberating through the walls, through her bones. She tried the door again, but it still wouldn't open. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she pulled harder, desperate to escape. The figure was now only a few feet away. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest as she turned, her back to the door, eyes desperately scanning the room for any means of escape. But there was nothing. No windows, no exits, just four walls closing in on her. And the figure. It was closer now. She could see it more clearly, though she wished she hadn't. The long black coat clung to its form, the fabric barely moving with each step. Its face was hidden in shadows, but she could feel its gaze piercing her, as though it were looking deep into her very soul. And then the voice came. "I've been waiting for you," it whispered, its voice low, gravelly, filled with an unearthly malice. "You can't escape." Sophia's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was the same voice from the mirror. The same voice that had whispered to her, that had haunted her every step since she arrived. She took a step back, then another, her mind racing. What did it want? What was it? "You can never leave," the voice continued, closer now, too close. "We're all trapped here. You're one of us now." Sophia's body trembled as she backed away from the figure, her feet stumbling, her legs weak beneath her. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. But no matter which way she turned, the figure followed her, its footsteps echoing in her ears. "Run," it whispered, its tone dripping with mockery. "But it won't matter. You're already part of this place." Sophia's eyes shot to the mirror once more, though she dreaded looking. She had to. Something inside her told her that the mirror was the key, that it held the answers she so desperately needed. But as her gaze fell upon the reflective surface, she saw the truth. The mirror wasn't reflecting the room she was standing in anymore. It was showing something else, something worse. The reflection in the glass wasn't just a distorted version of herself. It was the hallway stretching endlessly into the darkness, with countless figures standing at the far end. And they were all staring at her. There were dozens of them. Tall, shadowy figures with eyes that glowed in the dark. Their faces were hidden, but their presence was undeniable. They were waiting for her. Watching. Hungry. Sophia's blood ran cold. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. The figure in the room with her spoke again, its voice now rising in a crescendo. "They're waiting for you. They'll never let you leave." The walls seemed to close in further, and Sophia's vision blurred. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could hear was the voice, its voice and the sound of the footsteps getting closer. 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 And then, as if time itself had stopped, the figure lunged forward. Sophia screamed, her legs finally obeying as she turned and ran. The door still wouldn't open, but she didn't care. She was willing to break through it, to shatter it with her own hands if she had to. But it was too late. The walls closed in around her, the darkness swallowing her whole, the figures in the mirror stepping into her reality. There was no escape. There was no way out. Sophia was lost. Forever. And the house would never let her go. Sophia's heart pounded relentlessly in her chest as she ran, her breath shallow, her body pushed to its limits. Her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't dare stop. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the oppressive darkness closing in around her like a tightening noose. Every step was met with an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the house itself was conspiring to keep her trapped. The voices, the whispers, were getting louder now. She couldn't escape them. They were in her head, their hollow murmurs bouncing off the walls, taunting her, urging her to give in. You can't run. You can't hide. The words seemed to echo from all directions, filling her mind with terror. She wanted to scream, to claw at her own ears, but the fear was too overpowering. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the middle of the hallway, her body shaking uncontrollably. The floor beneath her felt cold, almost unnatural, and the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie life of their own. Then, as if summoned by her terror, the door at the end of the hall appeared before her. It had not been there before. She could have sworn it wasn't there just moments ago. But now it loomed, dark and foreboding, as if it were the only thing standing between her and whatever nightmare awaited. Without thinking, Sophia surged to her feet, desperate to escape the torment that had chased her for so long. She reached the door, her hands trembling as she grasped the cold handle. But the moment her fingers touched it, a sudden jolt of electricity shot through her, like an invisible force trying to pull her back into the abyss. She screamed, her body jerking, but somehow she managed to turn the handle. The door creaked open. What lay beyond was not what she had expected. Instead of the outside world, the light, the safety of the unknown, there was nothing. The door led into a vast, empty room. The walls, ceiling, and floor stretched infinitely into the darkness, as though the room had no end. Sophia's mind raced as she took a hesitant step inside. Her foot touched the floor, but it felt wrong, like she was stepping onto something that shouldn't be there, something that didn't belong. You shouldn't have come here, a voice rasped behind her. Sophia whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The figure was there again, standing just a few feet away in the pitch blackness. Its face was now partially visible, a twisted, grotesque mockery of the reflection she had seen earlier. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare directly into her soul. A chilling smile stretched across its face, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. You've walked right into our trap, it hissed. And now you'll never leave. Sophia's entire body went cold. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt and warp around her, the walls bending in ways that defied logic. The figure's smile grew wider, its presence looming larger, suffocating her. This is your new home, it whispered. You belong to us now. And just like that, the darkness enveloped her. Sophia screamed, but the sound was swallowed whole by the suffocating blackness. It was as if the very air had turned to thick, choking smoke, filling her lungs with an unrelenting pressure. She tried to breathe, tried to push the air out of her chest, but it was useless. The darkness surrounded her, consuming her from all sides. Then, something else began to happen. The walls, they moved. The shadows shifted, contorting into twisted forms that crept closer, crawling along the floor like sentient creatures. She could feel them, feel their cold touch on her skin, their breath against her neck. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. More footsteps. She wasn't alone. The room was filled with them now, figures, shadowy and indistinct, circling her like vultures, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. They whispered her name over and over, their voices rising in a cacophony of madness. Sophia? 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 The whispers began to distort, becoming something darker, more menacing. The air grew thick, oppressive as the figures moved closer, their forms now indistinguishable from the shadows. They were closing in on her, their presence suffocating, the darkness pressing in tighter and tighter. Sophia felt herself being pulled, her feet lifting off the ground. She tried to scream, but the air was gone, her voice choked off by an unseen force. Her body was weightless, her limbs limp as if they no longer belonged to her. She was floating in the dark, caught in a web of fear, unable to escape. You'll stay here with us forever, the figure whispered again, its voice thick with malice. You'll never see the light again. Sophia's eyes widened in horror as the truth hit her. This was it. This was where the darkness had been leading her all along. The house had never wanted her to leave. It had only wanted to trap her, to keep her in its eternal nightmare. And now she was part of it, one of the shadows, one of the figures trapped in the endless void. Sophia's vision blurred as the darkness swallowed her whole. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the smile of the figure, wide and twisted as it whispered, "You're ours now." The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. And the house remained silent once more. The end? Or is it? As the final echoes of Sophia's scream faded into the silence of the house, the story left an unsettling question hanging in the air. Was Sophia truly gone? Or was she merely waiting, patiently, for the next soul to step into the same trap she had fallen into? Whatever the answer may be, one thing was certain. The darkness never lets go. And in the shadows it's always watching, always waiting, ready for the next soul to wander too close. If you ever find yourself in a place like this, remember one thing. Don't go looking for answers in the dark, because sometimes, the dark finds you first. James had always heard the stories about the old house at the end of Elm Street. They said it was cursed, abandoned for years. No one ever went near it. But one night, curiosity got the better of him. As he stepped onto the creaky porch, the door swung open on its own as if inviting him in. He hesitated, the air around him thick with an unexplainable chill. Then, a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. "I've been waiting for you." What could be waiting for James inside? And what if the house itself wasn't as empty as everyone thought? You'll want to stick around because this is only the beginning. Every step he takes, the house draws him further into its dark secret. It was a cold evening when Henry first felt it, an unmistakable shiver that crawled down his spine as he stood on the edge of the forest. The trees, once a symbol of peace, now stood like towering giants, their bare branches reaching out like long, skeletal fingers. There was something unnerving about this place tonight. Something different. He took a step forward, and the sound of his boots crunching the frost beneath his feet was the only noise that broke the eerie silence. The sky above was overcast, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, leaving him in near total darkness. His breath came out in sharp puffs, visible in the air. Henry had walked these woods many times before, but tonight, it felt as if they were watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. Was it just his imagination? "You're just being paranoid," he muttered to himself, forcing his legs to move. But with every step, the unease grew. There was a sudden, sharp sound, a twig snapping underfoot far ahead of him. Henry froze. It could have been an animal, but this was different. The air was too still, too quiet. He glanced over his shoulder, but nothing was there. The feeling of being watched, however, hadn't gone away. It lingered, tightening around him like a noose. A soft rustling from the bushes to his right made him flinch. He squinted, trying to make out any movement in the shadows. Nothing. Yet the sound came again, this time closer. It has to be an animal, right? But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. He pressed on, now walking faster, eager to reach the clearing ahead where the trees opened up and the path led back to his cabin. The woods were never this oppressive, never this alive. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as if the trees themselves were closing in on him, the air heavy with a presence he couldn't see, but could definitely feel. A rustle behind him. He whipped around. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the dark woods. There it was again, shuffling, distant yet unmistakable. Was someone following him? Henry took a step back, eyes wide, pulse quickening. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as his senses heightened. No, there's no one here. It's just the wind. But the whispering sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere deep within the forest. It sounded almost like words, soft and unintelligible, but there was no mistaking the eerie, drawn-out tone. A voice. A person? He called out, his voice breaking the silence. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The sound stopped immediately. For a moment, the world was utterly still, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. Henry waited, his breath shallow in his chest. Just as he was about to turn around and leave, the whisper came again, but this time it was clearer, louder. "Henry?" His heart lurched in his chest. He froze, every muscle in his body tense with fear. The voice had called his name, but it wasn't a voice he recognized. It was thin, raspy, like it was coming from someone long dead. Impossible. He didn't know what to do. Should he run? Should he call for help? He knew no one would be around to hear him, though. It was just him and the forest. Whatever was in there with him, he was alone with it. The whispering continued, now a cacophony of voices, all muttering his name in an eerie, rhythmic chant. His pulse was deafening in his ears, but there was no turning back now. He took a shaky step forward, his legs trembling. The wind picked up, rushing through the trees with a high-pitched howl. It carried the whispers further, scattering them like leaves in a storm. They surrounded him. They seemed to know him, to want him. The cold air bit at his skin, and for the first time, Henry felt like he was truly not alone. Without thinking, he spun around and sprinted toward the clearing, his heart pounding louder with each step. The sounds behind him intensified, the rustling, the whispers, the scratching of unseen claws against bark. He didn't dare look back. The trees were closing in, their trunks forming a tunnel around him. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching out as if to grab him. Suddenly, his foot caught on a hidden root. He fell hard to the ground, his arms scraping against the frozen earth. Pain shot up his side, but he didn't have time to process it. He scrambled to his feet, only to be met with a chilling sight. The clearing he was rushing toward was now gone. Instead, the path had shifted and the forest had become a maze. He was lost. And the whispers? They were no longer whispers. They were screams. Pleas for help. And somewhere in that cacophony, he thought he heard the voice again, softer, more urgent. Henry, you can't leave. The forest won't let you. Henry's breath hitched in his throat as he staggered backward, his mind spinning, his body trembling. And then, as if the forest itself had decided it was time for him to know the truth, the moon finally broke through the clouds. And what he saw in the clearing made his blood run cold. Henry's breath came in jagged gasps as he stumbled through the forest. His heart raced in his chest, every step more frantic than the last. The forest, once familiar, now felt like an unrelenting trap, its twisted trees closing in around him like prison bars. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made his skin crawl. The voices had stopped for a moment, but the air felt thick with something watching him, waiting. I have to get out of here. His mind screamed it, but his legs seemed to move slower with each passing second, as if the very ground beneath him was pulling him down. The forest wasn't just alive, it was aware of him, and it wasn't going to let him leave. Henry's eyes darted around in the dark, looking for any sign of the path he had been following. But the trees, so tall and imposing, had rearranged themselves. The clearing he had seen was now completely gone, replaced by an unbroken sea of shadows. There was no exit, no way out. The ground felt softer here, the air heavier, like he was sinking into the very earth beneath him. It wasn't like this before. He staggered, his foot catching on something in the underbrush. With a sharp gasp, he reached out to steady himself, his hands brushing against something cold, smooth, and slick. He pulled back in shock, his eyes wide. His fingers had brushed against a stone, no, a headstone. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. A grave. But there were no graves here. The realization struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. The forest, it was hiding something. Something he wasn't meant to see. He glanced around wildly, the panic rising in his chest again. There were more gravestones now, dotting the landscape, half buried in the dirt. Each one looked ancient, weathered by time. Some of them were so old, the inscriptions had worn away, leaving only the stone and the memories of the dead. Suddenly, a noise broke through the suffocating silence, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and far too close. Henry's heart stopped. Someone, no, something, was following him. He spun around, but there was no one there. The feeling of being watched, however, intensified. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was the sense that eyes were on him from every direction, unseen but ever present, following his every move. The whispers returned, low and guttural, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. Henry? The voice was clearer now and closer. It knew his name. It had been calling him from the beginning, ever since he stepped into the forest. But what did it want? What was it leading him toward? Henry's legs moved on their own, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He had to find a way out. He couldn't stay here. But as he sprinted through the dark forest, dodging trees and trying to keep his footing, he began to feel the unmistakable weight of dread pressing down on him. The whispers grew louder, until they were a deafening chorus, surrounding him from all sides. And then he heard it. A low growl, deep and rumbling, echoing through the trees. Henry's blood ran cold. This was no animal. This was something unnatural. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding. His eyes strained to pierce the darkness ahead of him. He couldn't see anything, just the thick, oppressive blackness. But then, slowly, something began to emerge from the shadows. A pair of eyes, red, glowing, watching him. They were too large to belong to any animal he knew. They shimmered in the dark, like two burning coals, unblinking and cold. Henry's breath caught in his throat. They moved toward him, slow and steady, never breaking their gaze. As they got closer, Henry could make out a form. Tall, impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dark. It had no face, just those eyes, glowing and hungry. No. Henry backed away, his feet slipping in the soft dirt, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to move. He was frozen in place, staring at those eyes as they drew nearer, a sense of cold dread flooding his veins. The growling continued, a low, throaty sound that vibrated through the air. And then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command, deep and commanding, like it came from the very earth itself. "Henry?" The voice was hollow, empty, like it came from beyond the grave. "You're not leaving. Not yet." In that moment, Henry felt it, a coldness that seeped into his bones, an unrelenting chill that stole the warmth from his body. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if the forest had him trapped in its grip. He felt the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The eyes moved closer still, and Henry, driven by pure terror, finally managed to move his legs. He turned and ran, his body pushing through the darkness, every step taking him deeper into the heart of the forest. But the eyes were always there, following him, never leaving his sight. As he ran, the trees seemed to close in on him. The ground beneath him was uneven, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The whispers grew louder, louder until they were all he could hear, drowning out his own panicked breath. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the path ahead of him seemed to shift again. The clearing that had once been so near? It was gone. The forest had swallowed it whole. And with it, Henry. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps as he staggered through the trees, his legs aching, his mind swirling in a haze of fear. The thick, suffocating air wrapped around him, pressing down on his chest with each step. He didn't know where he was anymore. The forest had become a labyrinth, its paths twisting and shifting like a living thing. He could no longer trust his senses. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something, watching him. Was this the same place he had entered? The question clawed at his mind, but he pushed it aside. It didn't matter now. All that mattered was getting out, getting to safety. But how? The forest stretched on endlessly in every direction, an inescapable maze with no clear path forward. The red eyes were still there watching him. Henry could feel them even though he couldn't see them. They were always in the periphery of his vision, flickering in the shadows, like some predatory thing waiting for him to make a mistake. He could almost hear the growl of whatever it was lurking just beyond the trees, but when he spun around, there was nothing. Nothing but the deep, silent darkness. He cursed under his breath, the panic starting to take hold again. He had no idea how long he'd been running, but it felt like hours, maybe even days. His feet were sore, his clothes soaked with sweat, and his head was spinning from exhaustion. His thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and confusion. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being pursued hadn't gone away. It was worse now, more intense, like the air itself was alive with malice. I can't keep running forever. But there was no choice. There was no way out. Henry slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. Every small sound seemed to send a wave of panic through him. The snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, the distant echo of something moving in the underbrush. Was it him? Or was it something else? Something that was getting closer? He didn't want to look behind him, but he couldn't stop himself. His head jerked around, his eyes scanning the darkness, his heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the sounds of the forest. There was nothing. No glowing eyes. No figure. But the sensation of being hunted was undeniable. What the hell is going on? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The whispers, the eyes, the growling, it was all connected, he was sure of it. But how? What did it want? And why had it singled him out? Suddenly he heard it, a sound that froze him in place. A slow, deliberate footstep behind him, barely audible but distinct. Henry's body tensed, every muscle locked in fear. His heart skipped a beat as he turned sharply, expecting to see the creature. A shadow, a figure, something that wasn't supposed to be in this world. But there was nothing. The forest was empty, still, as if it had swallowed whatever had been following him. He exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself, but the relief was short-lived. He could still feel it, something lurking just beyond his line of sight. Watching. Waiting. The pressure in the air thickened, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Without warning, the ground beneath him shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor in the earth. But it was enough to make Henry stumble, his foot slipping in the soft, damp soil. He caught himself before he fell, but the unease inside him grew. The forest was shifting. It was reacting to him, moving in ways it shouldn't. The footsteps came again, louder this time, more insistent. Henry spun around, his eyes darting across the dark landscape. Nothing. The forest was still as death, but the sensation of being pursued was suffocating. He could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, like a physical force trying to crush the breath out of him. Then a flash of movement. A silhouette. It was there, just at the edge of his vision, darting between the trees. It was too fast for him to get a clear look, but Henry could feel it. A presence, something that wasn't human. He barely had time to react before it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness once more. His heart pounded in his ears as his legs moved on their own, carrying him forward in a blind panic. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just needed to get away from whatever was hunting him. It's not real. It can't be real. The thought repeated in his mind like a mantra, but it didn't help. Nothing could shake the terror clawing at him from the inside. Every part of him screamed to stop, to turn around and face whatever was following him, but he couldn't. He couldn't let it catch him. A loud crack echoed from behind him, sharp and sudden, like the breaking of a bone. Henry whipped around again, his body tense, every fiber of his being ready to bolt. But this time the forest was different. The trees, those twisted ancient trees, were closing in on him. Their gnarled branches reached out like fingers, scraping at the air as if they were alive. The sky above had darkened, clouds swirling with unnatural speed. The world was narrowing. He was trapped. No. A cold wind rushed past him, carrying with it the scent of decay, the unmistakable stench of something foul and rotten. It made Henry gag, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. But the air itself seemed to resist him now, pushing against him with an invisible force, dragging him back. The creature was closer now. He could hear its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, just behind him. But still he didn't dare turn. His breath came faster, his vision blurred by the terror coursing through his veins. His legs were giving out, his body too tired to keep running, but something deep inside him, the primal instinct to survive, kept him moving. And then it stopped. The footsteps, the growl, the pressure in the air. It all stopped. Henry froze, his body coiled tight, waiting for something to happen. The silence was deafening. The weight of the moment felt like it would crush him. And then the voice came again. "You can't outrun me." The words were soft but chilling, like a whisper directly in his ear, but there was no one there. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. Henry's heart raced in his chest. He had to get away, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He felt his body go numb, his mind blanking out, as if the forest had taken control of his very will. A shadow loomed over him, tall and impossibly thin, like something that had been pulled from the very fabric of his nightmares. It stretched toward him, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And then everything went black. Henry's consciousness returned slowly, like a fog lifting in the middle of a storm. His head throbbed, and a sharp pain ran through his body as though he had been battered by something unseen. His eyes fluttered open, but the world around him was dark, the air thick with an oppressive silence. For a long moment he lay there, unsure of where he was or how he had gotten there. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one heavier than the last. The last thing he remembered, his legs giving out, the shadow looming over him, the voice whispering words he couldn't comprehend, was a nightmare. But the more he tried to shake it off, the more he realized that the nightmare was far from over. The darkness wasn't just around him, it was in him, crawling under his skin. He tried to move, but his limbs felt stiff, unresponsive. Panic crept into his mind as he attempted to sit up, the weight of his own body a struggle. It felt as though he was trapped, bound by something invisible. And then, like a slap to the face, the memories came rushing back. The forest, the creature, the eyes. He gasped, his breath catching in his throat as he pushed himself into a sitting position. His fingers scraped against the cold, damp earth, the texture sharp and unfamiliar. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the ground beneath him felt uneven, like jagged rocks hidden beneath a thin layer of moss. He was outside, of that he was sure, but where? The forest? Had he been unconscious for hours? Days? Or had he never left the forest at all? His eyes scanned the darkness around him, but there was nothing. No movement. No figures. No glowing eyes in the distance. Just the stillness that made his skin crawl. And yet, something wasn't right. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they were alive, growing and shifting in ways they shouldn't. The trees stood tall and imposing, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes against the night sky. The ground around him was a tangled mess of roots, rocks, and debris, each step feeling like a trap ready to spring. Henry stood cautiously, his legs shaky beneath him. He took a few steps forward, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like the forest was closing in, pressing him from all sides, suffocating him with its weight. The more he tried to move, the more he felt the pull of something unseen, something that wasn't part of this world. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. And then, just as he thought he was beginning to regain control, he heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. "You can't leave." His blood ran cold. The voice was not his own. It came from somewhere deep within the darkness, a breathless murmur that seemed to travel through the very air around him. It wasn't the same voice as before, the one he had heard in the forest, but it was just as chilling, just as unnatural. Henry spun around, his eyes darting through the blackness, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. The trees loomed in silence, the shadows still. He couldn't tell if the whisper had come from within his own mind or if it had come from the forest itself. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow, but there was no time to think about it. The whispers were growing louder now, more frantic, like a chorus of voices rising up from the depths of the earth. Each one was saying the same thing. "You can't leave." The pressure in the air thickened, like something was closing in on him, suffocating him with its malevolent energy. Henry's breath caught in his throat as a cold, icy chill spread through his body, making his teeth chatter involuntarily. The forest felt alive now, alive with something ancient, something dark and hungry. He stumbled forward, trying to push through the ever-present weight of the shadows that seemed to press against him. But every step seemed to take him deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees closed in tighter, their branches scratching at his skin, their twisted forms leaning closer and closer, like they were reaching out to grab him. He had to get out. There was no other choice. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he moved, he couldn't escape. The whispers followed him, echoing in his ears, in his mind, in the very air around him. "You can't leave." His pulse quickened, the terror rising in his chest like a tidal wave. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but his voice was strangled, caught somewhere deep inside him. He couldn't make a sound, couldn't break free from the crushing grip of the forest. The wind began to howl, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the trees like a banshee's scream. The shadows around him seemed to grow darker, swirling and writhing in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was as if the very fabric of reality was bending and warping, twisting into something unrecognizable. Henry felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, a low rumble that vibrated through his bones. He stopped, frozen in place, his breath shallow and uneven as he waited for whatever was coming next. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rumbling stopped. The forest fell silent once more. For a moment, Henry thought he might be safe. But then he heard it, movement, soft and deliberate, coming from the trees around him. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. It was many. Dozens, hundreds, all moving in perfect synchrony like some kind of ritualistic march. His heart skipped a beat. The shadows were moving. He wasn't alone. "You're not alone." The voice came again, clearer this time, as though it was directly behind him. Henry whipped around, but again there was nothing. Only the trees, the dark, the endless, oppressive silence. He couldn't take it anymore. He turned and ran, pushing his legs harder than they'd ever gone before, ignoring the pain that shot through his muscles, the rocks that tore at his skin, the branches that lashed out at him. He ran blindly, his mind a blur of panic and terror. And then, just as he thought he had escaped, just as he thought he had broken free from the clutches of the forest, it appeared. A figure. Tall, dark, cloaked in shadow. It stood in the center of the path, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, burning with hunger and malice. The air around it rippled like heat waves, distorting the world around it, and Henry felt his stomach lurch, his body paralyzed in fear. It was waiting for him. And as he stood there, frozen, the figure spoke. "You belong to me now." Henry stood paralyzed, unable to look away from the towering figure before him. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, breathing in time with the rhythmic thumping of his heart. The figure's eyes burned like embers, their glow a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce through the thick veil of fear that clouded his mind. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped, frozen in place. The figure took a slow step forward, and the ground trembled beneath its feet. With each movement, the trees around him seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking in a low, mournful song. It was as though the entire forest itself was alive, waiting for something to happen, something dreadful. "You belong to me now." The words were spoken with a voice that echoed through the very core of Henry's being, a voice that chilled him to the bone, sending shivers of dread down his spine. He tried to speak, tried to scream, but his mouth was dry, his throat constricted as though an invisible force was choking him. His eyes darted to the ground, to the twisted roots that seemed to writhe beneath him, to the darkness that swallowed the path ahead. He had no escape. The figure took another step forward, its silhouette growing taller, more menacing. The shadows seemed to stretch out from it like tendrils, creeping and coiling around the trees, surrounding Henry with an air of undeniable malevolence. "Who are you?" Henry's voice finally broke through the suffocating silence, but it was barely a whisper, drowned out by the howling wind that suddenly whipped through the forest. "What do you want from me?" The figure's head tilted to the side, its movements almost fluid, like a predator studying its prey. There was no face, only darkness, like a void that consumed all light. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the air grew colder, each breath more labored than the last. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it stepped closer, until Henry could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on him. The wind stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie stillness. It was as if the world had held its breath. "You've always belonged to me, Henry. I've been waiting for you." The voice was low, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It slithered into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a suffocating coil. His vision blurred, his mind spun, and he couldn't tell if he was hearing the voice in his head or in the world around him. "What are you talking about?" Henry gasped, stumbling backward, his feet tangling in the roots beneath him. His heart thundered in his chest as panic surged through his veins. His whole body screamed for him to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground, as though the earth itself was pulling him down into its depths. The figure moved again, but this time, there was no mistaking its intentions. It wasn't just walking toward him, it was coming for him, slowly, inexorably, like a tidal wave of darkness that would drown him if he didn't escape. Henry's mind raced. He had to find a way out. His eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help him, anything that could break this suffocating grip on his soul. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees now more like monstrous creatures that were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. As the figure stepped forward once more, its presence overwhelming, Henry's breath hitched. The ground beneath him shifted, and for the briefest moment, he saw something, a shape, hidden among the roots of a nearby tree. Something ancient. Something that didn't belong in this world. With a desperate, sudden movement, Henry lunged toward the shape, hoping for anything that could save him. His fingers brushed against the cold surface of what appeared to be an old, weathered stone, covered in strange symbols that pulsed with an eerie glow. His heart raced faster as he recognized it for what it was. A barrier, a ward, something that had been placed here long ago to keep whatever was coming from getting too close. The figure's eyes narrowed as it saw Henry's discovery, and in that instant, the temperature dropped even further. The shadows around them seemed to twist and churn, the air thickening like smoke, and Henry felt a surge of fear unlike anything he had ever known. "You cannot hide from me, Henry." The voice was now louder, more insistent, shaking the very trees with its power. The stone beneath his hand began to tremble, and the strange symbols that glowed softly began to pulse faster, brighter. But Henry couldn't pull his hand away, he couldn't move. He was frozen, caught between the entity and the stone, unable to escape either. With a violent hiss, the figure reached out, its hands now extended toward him, long clawed fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally. It wasn't just trying to grab him, it was trying to rip his soul from his body, to claim him completely. "You will be mine. Forever." The figure's voice roared through the forest, and the shadows recoiled as if they feared the power of the words. The very earth beneath Henry's feet began to tremble violently, and the trees groaned, their branches rattling like bones. The stone pulsed one final time, sending a shockwave through the air. In that moment of sheer terror, Henry's mind shattered. He could feel the entity's power swirling around him, could feel its cold fingers reaching into his thoughts, trying to tear away everything that made him human. His vision blurred, his pulse thundered in his ears, and he was left with only one thought. He was never going to leave the forest. He was never going to escape. Then, as if answering his fear, a bright light flashed from the stone in his hand, a blinding pulse of energy that ripped through the air like a shockwave. The figure recoiled, screeching in pain as the light pushed back against it, causing the shadows to writhe in agony. But Henry couldn't move, couldn't comprehend what was happening. His world tilted, and before he could process what was happening, he was thrown to the ground, the stone slipping from his grasp, rolling away into the darkness. The ground around him cracked open, and a loud, ear-splitting scream filled the air, echoing through the trees. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he had ever heard before. The forest seemed to roar in defiance, its ancient power awakening in a final, desperate attempt to banish whatever evil had come. And then silence. The figure was gone. The shadows receded, and the trees returned to their stillness. But Henry knew it wasn't over. The forest had only given him a brief moment of peace. But he couldn't stay. Not here. Not now. He stumbled to his feet, his mind clouded with panic and confusion. The stone had fallen from his hand, and he had no idea where it had gone. All he knew was that something far worse was coming, something that the forest couldn't protect him from. Henry staggered through the forest, his breath ragged, his heart still pounding in his chest. Every step felt like it brought him deeper into the unknown. The trees, once ominous, now seemed alive, creaking and groaning with the weight of an unseen presence. The wind howled through the branches, a mournful wail that sounded almost like a warning. But Henry couldn't stop now. He couldn't stay. He had to get out. He looked behind him, half expecting the figure to be there, its eyes burning through the darkness. But there was nothing. The forest was quiet, eerily so. The kind of silence that seemed unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. The ground beneath him was uneven, and his legs felt like lead, dragging him forward with every step. His mind was foggy, struggling to make sense of everything that had happened. He tried to remember the symbols on the stone, the pulse of light that had thrown the figure back, but the memory felt like a distant dream, slipping away the longer he thought about it. The feeling of being watched never left him, though. It lingered in the back of his mind, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. And no matter how fast he walked, no matter how hard he tried to escape, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still trapped in the forest. Then, without warning, the ground beneath his feet gave way. Henry cried out, his body pitching forward as the earth crumbled beneath him. He reached out desperately, his hands grazing the sharp edges of rocks as he tried to catch himself. But it was no use. He tumbled into the darkness below, falling deeper and deeper, until the sound of his fall was drowned out by the deafening roar of the earth shifting around him. When he finally hit the ground, he groaned in pain, his body aching all over. He lay there for a moment, stunned, trying to get his bearings. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light. He was in some kind of underground cavern, the walls made of jagged stone. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the scent of decay. It was cold down here, colder than anything he had ever felt. Panic surged in him as he realized he had no idea where he was. The fall had disoriented him, and now he was trapped in a place he couldn't escape. His pulse quickened, and he scrambled to his feet, looking around in desperation. There was no way out. The only way was down, through a narrow passage that led deeper into the earth. And then he saw it. At the far end of the cavern, a flickering light shone through a crack in the rock. It wasn't a natural light. It was an unnatural, sickly glow that seemed to pulse and flicker like a dying flame. Henry knew deep down that he had no choice. He had to move toward it. With trembling hands, he began to walk toward the light, his every step echoing in the stillness. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in on him, the shadows thickening with every step he took. His heartbeat was deafening in his ears, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked around him. He reached the crack in the rock, the light growing brighter as he drew closer. The crack was narrow, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. It was his only way out. Without hesitation, he pushed his way through, the jagged edges of the rock scraping against his skin. On the other side, the air was warmer, but the temperature didn't bring comfort. The chamber he entered was vast, far larger than anything he had expected. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, much like the ones on the stone he had touched earlier. They glowed faintly, their meaning lost to him, but their presence was undeniable. It felt as though the entire room was watching him, waiting for him. And then, at the center of the room, he saw it. A massive altar, carved from the same jagged stone that made up the walls. The altar was surrounded by hundreds of candles, each one flickering with that same sickly light. The flames danced and swayed, casting eerie shadows across the room. On the altar lay an object, a relic of some kind. It was small, intricately carved, and made of a dark, polished material that reflected the light in strange, unsettling ways. Henry took a hesitant step forward, his mind screaming at him to turn around and leave. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening. The object on the altar seemed to call to him, pulling him in with an invisible force. As he reached out to touch it, a sharp pain shot through his hand. He recoiled, gasping in pain, but the moment he pulled away, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The symbols on the walls flared to life, glowing brighter, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was not a whisper. It was a roar, deafening and bone-chilling. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the world around him began to spin. The air grew heavier and the temperature plummeted, the warmth of the room replaced by a biting cold that felt like ice crawling under his skin. The ground beneath his feet began to crack, long fissures running through the stone, as though the very earth was splitting apart. The altar trembled, and the object on it began to glow with an unnatural light, pulsing in time with Henry's frantic heartbeat. "You cannot escape me, Henry." The voice boomed again, and this time it was not alone. Other voices joined in, low, guttural, whispering from all directions. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing longer, stretching toward him like hands, claws reaching out to drag him into the abyss. Henry's mind raced. He had to leave. He had to escape. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath him gave way again. This time there was no falling. There was no sudden drop. The earth simply swallowed him whole. He screamed, his voice lost in the endless void as he plummeted into the darkness. Henry's scream was swallowed by the abyss. His body fell, falling into an endless, bottomless void, his limbs flailing as the darkness enveloped him. Every moment of his fall felt like an eternity. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. His thoughts scrambled for answers, for any sign that he wasn't about to meet his end in this cold, suffocating void. Then suddenly there was light, dim at first, then blinding. Henry's eyes burned as the light grew brighter and brighter, forcing him to close them. His body continued to fall, the air rushing past him with deafening force. And then, with a sudden jarring impact, he landed. The shock knocked the wind out of him, and he lay there for a moment, gasping for breath. When his senses returned, he opened his eyes, and what he saw made his blood run cold. He was no longer in the underground cavern. No, this place, it was something else entirely. It was a room, an ancient, decaying room, the walls covered in layers of dust and grime. The air was thick with the scent of rot, as though the very room had been abandoned for centuries. The ceiling was high and cracked, the beams above him groaning under the weight of time. But it wasn't the room that terrified him. It was the figure standing at the far corner of the room, watching him with an expressionless gaze. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, too tall, draped in tattered robes that seemed to flow and shift with an unnatural fluidity. Its face was obscured, hidden by a dark hood, but Henry could feel its eyes on him, cold, unblinking, and full of something ancient. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as though an invisible force had rooted him to the spot. Panic surged through him as he realized that he was trapped once again, unable to escape the presence that towered over him. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step making the air grow colder. "You should not have come here." The voice, so cold, so hollow, sent a shiver down Henry's spine. It was the same voice that had haunted him in the forest, in the cavern, in every moment of his terror. But now it sounded different, deeper, more ominous. The figure moved closer, the sound of its footsteps reverberating through the room like thunder. Henry's heart raced, and for a moment he thought he might lose control. But then something strange happened. The figure stopped just a few feet away from him and extended a hand. In its hand was the object, the same dark, polished relic that had been on the altar. It gleamed with that sickly light, pulsing in rhythm with Henry's heartbeat. "Take it," the figure hissed. Henry's eyes widened, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He knew he had no choice. There was no turning back now. He had to face whatever this was, whatever force was manipulating him, pulling him into its grasp. With trembling hands he reached for the relic. As his fingers brushed against it, a searing pain shot up his arm, making him gasp. The relic was burning him, its touch like fire, yet ice-cold all at once. His body tensed, his muscles locking in place as the pain spread through him, suffocating him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain stopped. Henry gasped, his body trembling with the aftermath of the agony. He looked up, his vision blurry, and saw the figure standing before him once again. Its dark eyes gleamed with something darker. "You have awakened what should never have been disturbed." Henry's mind raced, his thoughts frantically trying to make sense of it all. He had come so far, survived so much. only to be faced with this final horrifying truth. This force, this entity, had been waiting for him all along, lurking in the shadows, drawing him in with every step he took. It had been watching him, guiding him, manipulating him for reasons he couldn't comprehend. But now it was too late. The room began to shake, the walls cracking and crumbling as if the entire world was coming apart. The light from the relic flickered wildly, casting grotesque, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally. And then, with a deafening crash, the walls of the room shattered. Henry screamed, his voice drowned out by the violent roar of the crumbling room. His body was thrown back as the world around him collapsed, the ground giving way beneath him as he fell once again into the void. But this time, there was no bottom, no ground to catch him. He continued to fall, his scream echoing into the endless darkness, the cold air rushing past him, the sound of his heartbeat the only thing he could hear. And then, silence. The story of Henry's descent ends here, but perhaps, just perhaps, there's more lurking beyond the darkness, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to awaken it.